So once again, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this Pathways Forum on the role of environmental humanities and sustainability science. I'm very pleased today to welcome our speakers, Jorge Marcone, Kenneth Nsah, also known as Nsah, and Nathalie Blanc. And it's particularly an exciting moment for us at the Pathways Initiative because we have been wanting to focus on environmental humanities for quite some time now in the context of a webinar. And we are doing it today in collaboration with UNESCO's BRIDGES Coalition, which is a coalition anchored in the humanities, but of course reaches beyond that field and aiming for action in sustainability science. And with us today is Stephen Hartman, the Executive Director of BRIDGES. And I am not sure if Lucy Atala, who's the director of the UK hub of BRIDGES, is already here with us, but she will probably join us in a few minutes if she's not here already. And we will get to hear more also about the BRIDGES Coalition and the work that they do. So with this, I am passing my invisible mic to Stephen or Lucy, whoever wants to take the floor, and you can start whenever you are ready.
Okay, I think what I'd like to do to start off with is just give some background on a sort of capsule history of BRIDGES, so that you have some sense of who we are. We're much newer than Future Earth, but we've been a while in the making, and I'll tell you a little bit about how that has been the case now. So to begin with, I'd say that BRIDGES began through a collaboration of three partners: UNESCO, the International Council for Philosophy and Human Sciences, and originally the Nordic Network for Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies, but that eventually that role ended up being taken on more and more by another entity, which is the Humanities for the Environment Global Observatory Network, and in particular the Circumpolar Observatory of BRIDGES, or of Humanities for the Environment. These partners were among a number of others that were involved in 2015 in a project that had been financed by the government of Japan, and which was a UNESCO project looking at broadening the application of the sustainability science approach. Somebody's drilling in my building. I hope that that's not making too much noise right now. Of course, that's got to happen right now. And this project was started as a means of looking back at the state of the field of sustainability science from the beginning of the millennium, right after the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, when efforts to form a more coherent sustainability science field were initiated. And the idea was to, through a series of workshops examining the state of the art of sustainability science, looking to see how sustainability science as a field could optimally be supportive of UNESCO member states and their obligations to meet their obligations according to the Paris Agreement, according to the SDGs, which were then in 2015 when this project began, just beginning or just being formalized. This resulted in this document that I just showed you. I'm sorry, I'm very distracted by this drilling that's going on. That, of course, had to begin. I haven't heard a thing all day. But anyway, the guidelines on sustainability science and research education was the output document after 2 years of these workshops that took place in several places internationally, and in that guidelines document, a number of new things were introduced as policy guidelines, you could say. And that was, among other things, the importance of the humanities having a central role, not simply an instrumental role, not simply a translational role for knowledge production in science, but a central role. And with that, too, other knowledge communities, non-academic knowledge communities, indigenous knowledge communities, and others. As a result of this project, the UNESCO formulated these guidelines as a means of taking these recommendations through UNESCO to the UNESCO commissions of member states and then hopefully affecting the discussion at the level of higher education, research, innovation in different national contexts. Many of the actors who were involved in that 2-year project realized that something needed to be done to complement that. And therefore, a new project was initiated, visioning something that could, from the bottom up, meet that sort of top-down approach in the middle, and at the same time work to create capacities and structures transversely that could better connect up different silos, different knowledge domains with one another that didn't have a strong history of integrated cooperation and integrated knowledge production together, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary knowledge production. So that was the beginning of Bridges. And Bridges itself had 4 workshops between 2019 and 2020 at UNESCO headquarters, at Nsah in Portugal, at Sigtuna in Sweden, and finally a 4th during the pandemic, a 4th virtual workshop that took place. And there was a remarkable consistency across these 4 workshops with the different organizations and institutions and programs that came together. There were about 40 some odd programs that came together from around the world, working to vision a new approach to sustainability science that could involve humanities, the arts, qualitative social sciences, non-academic knowledge communities in a more central way. And that became essentially the vision for Bridges. And out of that, Bridges, after our Sigtuna workshop, which formulated a report on where the sort of roadmap for Bridges, if it could be established, where it would be going, we applied all of these member organizations as a budding coalition. And that's when Humanities for the Environment came more on board as a partner in the final stages as we were in the process of applying to the Management of Social Transformations program. The Management of Social Transformations program has its bureau managed by, and its secretariat managed rather by the UNESCO Social and Human Sciences sector. So these 3 partners, UNESCO and SIPSH and Humanities for the Environment, came together and applied to the Intergovernmental Council of the Management of Social Transformations program to become a UNESCO MOST Sustainability Science Coalition with a distinctive humanities, qualitative social sciences, arts, and non-academic communities, knowledge communities, components that would be part of this budding coalition. And you see some of the partners, or rather some of the members that had been involved in that visioning process here. As a result of that process, and here's a sort of a list of the organizations and institutions that were represented at our first General Assembly in the summer of 2021. As a result of that process, we were endorsed by the Management of Social Transformations program and began a process then of becoming de facto the Sustainability Science Coalition of MOST, with a very prominent humanities dimension to it. And after that, we sent out a call for expressions of interest among the established coalition partners and network to begin to form hubs that would provide a capacity for an international program office, a distributed capacity. And here are the partners or here are the hubs that were approved. And we now have 5 hubs. There's 7 icons here, but that's because some of these are doubling up: the Climate Change and History Research Initiative and at Princeton University, and the Human Ecodynamics Research Center at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. So our goal is manyfold. Our goal is to promote sustainability science that is inclusive, promote those previously marginalized knowledge communities within sustainability science, and to promote as well the structures, the transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary structures that allow greater integration of knowledge domains across the natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, arts, and non-academic knowledge communities. So in a nutshell, that's what BRIDGES is. We've now got these 5 hubs that have established in the last year, and we're moving into a new stage in the forthcoming year with a new permanent governance structure and really beginning to operationalize the plan and the vision for BRIDGES. So that's all I'm going to say right now. I can come in later with some additional information as we begin to talk, if there are specific questions that this group may have.
Thanks very much, Stephen. I just want to check whether we have any clarifying questions at this point, keeping in mind, of course, we'll have time for a more general discussion at the end, especially about the role that BRIDGES can play to give the humanities a more central place, as you were talking about in your presentation, Stephen. I don't see any questions at this point, and because we have quite a few presentations today, I suggested maybe we already move on to Jorge's presentation. If you are ready, Jorge, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, whatever is appropriate from where you're following us today. We were posed with a couple of questions. One is what role can the humanities have in transformative research, and what is the problem of visibility of the humanities in sustainability sciences? So I decided to assume an audience today that is actually not familiar with this interaction, that is not familiar with working with colleagues in the humanities, and is not familiar with arts and humanities interventions in transformative research, or colleagues in the sciences that have very little of this kind of experience. And for this, I'm going to assume the position not only as a literature scholar, which I am. I teach Latin American literature at Rutgers University, but I'm going to assume a relatively conventional identity as a literary scholar, which I don't think I am, but for the purpose of the discussion today, maybe it will be worth it. And in my first reflection then has to do with what can a regular literary scholar or a regular faculty of literature can do in problem-solving research. I think that for those who are familiar with interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary problem-solving research, they know by now how important techniques related to the arts and the humanities are for building the communication, the engagement, and a sense of community within transdisciplinary teams. It's another way of facilitating the communication between all the members of the research team. And it can also have a place, of course, in the communication to larger audiences of the research that is being done or has been done. But also it may have an impact as well when communicating with decision makers, even though I think we usually assume that decision makers will be more interested in knowledge and information coming from evidence-based forms of production of knowledge. In my experience, having an interdisciplinary team addressing the decision makers can make a lot towards making a persuasive argument. We know that in general, arts and literature and performance and are places, are forms of knowledge in which what we usually find is an openness to those experiences that we receive as human beings when we receive experience as non-human beings. Nature, the interrelationship with nature, is among the top 3 themes or topics in the history of art almost in any place. So it is a site where we can not only read about this, but it is a site from which we can engage in our own explorations with non-human beings. Literary scholars can be very helpful in identifying what are the media that are relevant for our research and what are the beliefs and values and questions of memory that are relevant for our research, even in a problem-solving oriented research. Not necessarily all the values and beliefs that are relevant to solving an issue or for addressing an issue are directly related to ideas about nature. There may be other issues at play in that equation, and any colleague trained in the humanities will be able to be attuned to that and will be able to bring up that information to a team. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not an expertise only of humanities scholars, but certainly humanities scholars can do a lot in making sure that we are meeting the ideal standards for diversity, equity, and inclusion in our project. Problem-solving oriented research in general involves some sort of healing of communities, and having somebody or more than one person in your team with a humanities background can certainly help in imagining that healing in a more holistic terms. Humanities colleagues can also help us interpret our own vocabulary and our own narratives in sustainability science. That ability to do a little bit of self-criticism, to become aware of our own discourses as experts and when we communicate with other people. And it is known, at least in the United States, within humanities programs and departments, that we struggle with issues of assessment, how to assess the impact of art and humanities in site-based and research program-oriented research. But on the other hand, it's a question that is an open question. There are other ways in which we can meet and measure and understand the impact of art and humanities in ways that may not be as quantitative as we do with other aspects. And I think there another level in which colleagues from art and humanities can help have an impact in this kind of region is not necessarily related to site-based problem-solving projects, but in general, the ability of scholars in the humanities to mobilize an important symbolic capital. The literature of a country, the national literature of a country is symbolic capital that can move many people within government and within society. And also the ability to reinterpret that symbolic capital. I wanted to give an example very quickly about this, relates to one of my projects, but I think that in a couple of slides it will be clear what I meant by this. I study Amazonian literatures from Peru, and as can you imagine, these literatures are written in many different indigenous languages and as well as in Spanish. There are more than 60 ethnic groups and 13 language families in the Peruvian Amazon. So we have a significant challenge of diversity when studying Amazonian literatures in Peru. They are written by subjects with diverse and even conflicting backgrounds and interests. And usually the subject of the study of a literary scholar is to pay attention to how those differences cannot be reduced and are irreconcilable. They do not meet, those different traditions are not meeting each other, and how the relationship between those different traditions can in fact be understood in terms of a colonial history. There is the option, however, if we can borrow a different framework, like for instance, borrow a framework from social ecological resilience studies and try to understand as a whole those Amazonian literatures in terms of what kind of plays, what kind of knowledge has been produced there in terms of learning and adaptation to environmental change and disturbances. And for instance, it was not difficult to me once I used another framework for finding 5 significant patterns in 100-year periods of Amazonian literature. Amazonian literatures try to learn from those disturbances and the legacies of boom and bust economic cycles in the ecosystem. It's a literature that rejects explaining transformations with nature-culture binarisms. It's not necessarily that they have a clear alternative to that, but acknowledge the possibility of explaining transformations only on the basis of discourses that practice this binarism. Persistently, Amazonian literatures have been collecting and assimilating and even appropriating oral indigenous narratives or oral rural narratives as part of that search for other forms of knowledges. There is always the claim and the expression of the need for developing more and alternative education that it is Amazonian-based in order to deal with the challenges of the region. And at the end, it's a literature that also recognizes, even reluctantly, that the non-human beings have an intervention in the creative process. In general, I am finding that they express a perplexity, acknowledging what a wicked problem is, although not necessarily they have solutions to it. But in general, as a whole, it's a corpus of narrative that are trying to build some confluence of highly diversity population towards a shared vision. There is another question that Gilles posed to us, which has to do with the visibility of sustainability. And I want to respond to that in 2 slides, and then I'll be done. One of them, wearing my hat as a faculty or a researcher, and another one, wearing my hat as an administrator, which I also, it's a role that I also play within my university. I'm finding that arts and humanities, just like science, we are sharing the same vocabulary on transdisciplinarity, or we are sharing the same vocabulary as at Rutgers we prefer to call the publicly engaged research. And in fact, I want to mention that document that Stephen mentioned before, the guidelines on sustainability research and education, is a very useful document for everybody in terms of very clear definitions. It's not a very long document. It has an agenda for research and education. I'm finding that we essentially share the same vocabulary, but we are not reading each other. We don't know what is going on in terms of transdisciplinary research in the arts and the humanities, and we don't know what is going on as well in the sciences. Also for me, the question is not where is the visibility of the humanities in transformative research, but from the perspective of the humanities, to me it's also interesting where are the sciences inside a specific arts and humanities research and engage. It's very easy to find it between the lines, but in the narratives and how we tell our stories of publicly engaged research, the role of the sciences seem to go underground. And so that led us to the conclusion that we need more visibility of exemplary projects. And that is something that we are working at SARAS in Uruguay with Arizona State University, with the Latin American Observatory to, let's say we can develop a website of at least 20 cases that are exemplary in many ways that can, and that website can work as an archive from which we can start more research on the problem of the visibility of the humanities or the sciences in the humanities, but also as a site where there are models that other initiatives can use as a reference in order to build their own projects. And finally, as a university official, there are certain things that we are doing, and maybe this is valuable and can be of some insight to colleagues in other places. Essentially, what it is at stake is the turn throughout the universities, at least in the United States, into promoting and rewarding publicly engaged research. And to a great extent, that means the flexibility of these colleagues to be acknowledged when publishing in non-academic journals, and the flexibility in the evaluation and promotion process to publish in unusual venues for the fields in which to which this faculty belong. And of course, there are a lot of initiatives that can be taken with undergraduate students. I have in mind this new minor in environment and creative expression that we are developing for the reason that on the one hand, it reflects a new set of values in our campus that are expressed in that quote about equitable representation, but also because it's a project that is connecting 3 different schools. And with connecting 3 different schools, which in itself was an interesting bureaucrat challenge, what we are allowing is that through that minor, the students will have the opportunity to see in the classroom interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work when they get out of the classroom, modeled by their faculty themselves, and having students with different educational backgrounds working together even before they leave campus. And so it won't be their first insight problem-solving project, the one in which they will have to interact with colleagues from other disciplines. And I think I will leave it there, and we can take more in the conversation later.
Thank you very much, Jorge. We have a few minutes now, in fact, for questions or reactions to what Jorge just presented to us. Feel free to raise your hand. Also, you can use the chat if you're not in a position to open your mic. I'm going to start while everyone is thinking. I'm going to start with a question, Jorge. You mentioned in your presentation that one of the potential added value of humanities in a project is considering healing from a more holistic perspective. I suppose you were talking about healing in the sense of sustainability or restoring ecosystems, or maybe you can specify exactly what you meant, but also I'd be curious if you could expand a little bit on how that take place more concretely, how healing can be approached more holistically, simply by virtue of including humanities scholars in a project.
Thinking particularly about Latin America, the rise of the environmental movement in Latin America, whatever an environmental movement is in Latin America, chronologically is connected to the political response that came after a period of dictatorships in Latin America. So the rise of the movement is connected to the trauma of the legacy of the repression during those political movements. Even in the United States, I don't think it's a coincidence that the rise of the environmental movement was connected or was happening at the same time that the civil rights movement, and was happening at the same time that the anti-war movement. So I think that in that sense, we have enough evidence or enough experience for understanding that whatever the environmental movement comes, or environmental agendas comes, or sustainability agendas bring, is going to be processed as part of other things that need to be healed. And in that way, it will become integrated. And often the literature and the arts are doing these kind of connections in uninhibited ways, since they are not limited by disciplinary methodologies and restrictions. And in that sense, they can set the agenda, they can set a path from which we can follow with further research.
Thanks, Jorge, for clarifying this for me. Any other questions or reactions from anyone? Jennifer, go ahead.
My little hand. I'm just curious. I think you see a lot in the articles in higher ed right now, kind of lowballing the value of the humanities, or a real question of where higher education and humanities fit in general. And I'm just curious, in developing this program across 3 different schools, and it being kind of a co-creation model with students, and it feels like you're really listening to your students, what their feedback has been. And I think taking into account that they're really entering a complex time where probably to navigate, they're going to have a kind of multi-hyphen career, or definitely a global outlook. So I just was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, the student input.
We have, at this point, maybe I shouldn't have gotten too much into the celebratory mood, but at this point, we have overcome the bureaucratic and administrative hurdles. So we don't have yet, the program is not running yet. The process of getting it approved by 3 different schools is challenging, but we are going to meet that expectation. However, the project was initiated by the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences that reached to the School of Arts, our Mason Gross School of the Arts, and then to us in the Humanities departments at Rutgers. So what we know for sure is that the students in the School of Environmental and Biological Science are the ones that are interested in, or at least a group large enough for demanding this kind of education, and that they are not interested in having these courses offered in the classrooms in which they are with which they are familiar already, but to go and do it in other venues. So that is what has encouraged us to propose the program, and in general, the faculty has been very receptive about it. We were able to run it through the curriculum committee with some reservations, but there was no ideological concern or reservation about the project. I think everybody's buying into the idea of this kind of collaborations. Is just the details, the granulate things that present the challenges.
Stephen, you had your hand up a little bit ago. Did you still want to ask a question?
I could say something just very quickly, and that's that, and it wasn't the point I was going to make, but in light of what Jorge was just saying in answer to this latest question, those kinds of, I think the implications of what Jennifer had asked about, and what Jorge was emphasizing, the institutional implications are significant. We really, I think, without renewing structures and including the very structures by which institutions incentivize interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work and border crossing across scientific domains and academic domains, we're always going to be running into a sort of a self-defeating situation whereby we have ambitions that are not reinforced structurally, not in the calls that call for interdisciplinary projects, not in the calls that come from university leadership asking for greater collaboration across faculties, because the incentive structures actually work against that kind of collaboration. So I think that it may not be a sort of a sexy topic, but I think it's a very important topic when we're thinking about how institutions can support the kind of work that I think by now is widely understood that we need to be doing.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm going to take one last question, Adriana.
Thank you. Good morning. Well, I'm a little bit worried about how we can use frameworks like this socio-ecological framework to understand and to read all these indigenous writings, as Jorge was explaining. I'm worried about how we could maybe start again misinterpreting what the indigenous people try to express in those writings. So I'm worried about the way of how the art, the humanities and art from the Western perspective is reading another kind of philosophy and way of understanding the world. So my question is how you deal with that, and how you deal with these ideas of decolonizing also academia, that this is very important right now, and in the also environmental discourses and transdisciplinary discourses, that we need to start to thinking also from outside of this paradigm. And I understood that the idea of the bridges that the program or the thing that you are trying to do is bring all these different kind of knowledge systems. So I'm wondering how you are doing it without diminishing this knowledge and not using the Western framework to interpret another knowledge system, and how we don't fail again in misinterpreting this knowledge. Thank you.
In the process of collecting and assimilating and publishing, for instance, in the case of oral narratives, indigenous or rural, and I will come back later to that difference, the literary genres used for that transcription, the structure of the text, the language chosen, the style in the language chosen for doing that transcription, all that has been already studied in terms of a practice within the literary or the artistic domain, a practice that repeats the same patterns of colonialism or even extractivism that have taken place at another level different than the actual process of transcribing this. So the question of imposing a framework, like a Western framework, is something to which literary scholars pay a lot of attention precisely in the very textuality of the process. I don't think we have to stay away from that conversation. I don't think that another view will imply not following that kind of conversation, but that we can have other ways of approaching. And partly I'm driven in the case, at least in the case of Peru, because in the Peruvian Amazon, there are 4 million people living in the Peruvian Amazon, mostly in rural areas. And less than 500,000 are indigenous people. So when taking into consideration the social environmental challenges in the environment, giving visibility to the indigenous people should not be at the expense of making invisible other people that are part of those ecosystems and that don't get any representation because besides they are not white people. They are usually mestizo, peasant migrants from the Andes looking for land because they are running away from land scarcity in the Andes. So that is what led me to think about a larger framework in which a larger framework that will allow for a shared vision. And the other, and I'm done here with the response, is that indigenous people themselves are active and conscious about the way they want to engage with non-indigenous frameworks, and they are on top of their own agency as to what they want to use or what they want not to use. It is in Amazonian indigenous culture, the standard, the default in culture is the sharing of the knowledge and its metamorphosis. It's not family affiliation or relationships or friendships. So I agree with what Adriana was saying, but also I think we have to pay attention to what the indigenous people themselves think about how to reach out and to use other frameworks of knowledge.
Thank you, Adriana, for this really interesting question, and Jorge for an equally interesting answer. I have a feeling that we'll be getting back to that topic during the discussion. But for now, I suggest that we move to our next presentation from Kenneth and Nsah. If you are ready, Kenneth, go ahead. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this invitation, Chiefs. A lot of the things that I'm going to be saying, I think Jorge has already said them, but I think repetition is also a good strategy of engagement or learning of pedagogy. But I also think that it's important to to create that connection, because he ends with a great connection, the concrete examples from the Amazon, and my own work is very well grounded in the Congo Basin. So I think our two approaches are in a sense place-based, or at least even if it's in part. And and I thought that I will first start with saying, trying to introduce the Congo Basin, and this is because unlike the Amazon basin, the Congo Basin is not as known as the Amazon, and it's not as popular outside of that area. And even paradoxically, sometimes through my research, I've come to understand that there are even many people who come from countries of the Congo Basin, and they are not aware of something existing called the Congo Basin. So I will start with that, and that's where like some of my concrete examples are going to come from. And also because I think another thing I share with him is our background in literary studies, although of course with interdisciplinarity in terms of environmental humanities and ecocriticism and all whatnot. So the first thing therefore is to talk about the Congo Basin, which is also the core of my doctoral dissertation that was defended last year with the curious title, Can Literature Save the Congo Basin? The Congo Basin, where is it and what is it? So it's the second largest tropical rainforest in the world, and after the Amazon. So, and it's not as known as the Amazon, and it is found in the Central African sub-region, and it cuts across at least 6 countries, including Cameroon, where I come from, Gabon, Central African Republic, the 2 Congos, Congo Brazzaville and Congo Kinshasa, or the DRC and Equatorial Guinea. And of course, there are other definitions of the Congo Basin that go beyond these 6 countries to include other countries like, for example, Angola, Uganda, Rwanda, etc., and even sometimes up to Chad. And this is a place with an estimated 1.7 billion square meters of land surface, and it drains an area approximately the size of Western Europe. And it is home to thousands of species of wildlife, both plant and animal species. For example, 700 species of fish, 400 species of mammals, 1,000 species of tropical plants, and 80% of these are native to the Congo Basin. And the Congo Basin holds about 10% or even more of global biodiversity. Not only biodiversity, but also cultural diversity, having about 75 million or plus people from at least 150 or more ethnic communities, including indigenous people who are often called problematically in quotes, the pygmies, but we have the various names for them like the Baka, the Batwa, and so on and so forth, and who depend on the tropical rainforests of the Congo Basin for their food, for their fresh water, for their shelter, for their cultural, their spirituality, and much more. And of course, the Congo Basin is also very popular for mineral resources, including copper, diamond, and timber, and uranium, and of course, and all this go petrol, and all this go with extractivism and the effects that we know about extractivism, especially in the global south. And of course, it is also very crucial in terms of its capacity for carbon sequestration. Not only through its tropical rainforest, its trees, but also recently because it has come to international attention. I don't want to use the word discover because, of course, I know that reports in many Western newspapers talk about the discovery of peatlands in the Congo Basin, and I don't want to call that discovery. I want to call that bringing them to the attention of the Western world or the international community, because prior to that, there are people who live there and indigenous people who are aware of those peatlands, of course. And these peatlands are capable of storing carbon dioxide, approximately 30 billion tons of that. And so that's like about 3 years of global carbon emissions. But of course, the Congo Basin is also quite under threat. It's threatened by a lot of factors, including extractivism, including industrialization in the global north, including in the ecological transition in the global north, but also logging, agriculture, wildlife trafficking, demographic expansion, urbanization, etc., etc. And so I ground a lot of my work, I based a lot of my work on the Congo Basin, especially because I think that not only the humanities or the environmental humanities need this visibility, but also, of course, the Congo Basin. And my work is informed largely by ecocriticism, particularly post-colonial ecocriticism, which all fall within the environmental humanities. So although I prepared some slides here with some definitions and excerpts of definitions of ecocriticism or post-colonial ecocriticism and environmental humanities, I'm not sure I will spend time on this for now. I think I will just go through them quickly as I'm doing now, and I would rather go now to the next segment of my presentation, where I will make an attempt to answer the more practical questions that we had to use in framing our discussions for today. And so that's why I'm asking, what can literature do to advance sustainability? And beginning from here, yes, I think that literature can intervene in different aspects of the sustainability or the transition to sustainability, and in addressing the global climate crisis and ecological crisis that we are facing today. And one or some of these areas include communication, education, and activism. And I'm explaining in terms of literature, especially eco-literature or eco-art, literature and art, particularly storytelling on, let's say, deforestation, pollution, waste, toxicity, and all whatnot can help us in the form of environmental communication or climate communication. And of course, and that is why there is now an emerging how do I call it, bridge between eco-criticism and now environmental communication, as evidenced, for example, by a book like this one, the Rutgers Handbook of Eco-Criticism and Environmental Communication, that was published in 2019. And I also think that literary studies and art studies can also help us in promoting education for sustainable development more globally, and in doing this, so we can use literature excerpts from texts, whether they are poems or novels or they are pieces of theater or drama or other art forms like music, like film and cinema. We can use them, or even fine arts. We can use them, for example, to be able to carry out activities in classrooms and in other venues where we are teaching people about sustainability. And this could be in addressing, among many other SDGs like SDG 4 and SDG 13 on quality education and climate change. And literature, as I've also argued in an article that is about to be published, I think that literature inspires, it chronicles youth climate activism, but at the same time, activism and advocacy, but at the same time, it also inspires. So I assume that if younger people who are not already taking action for climate, or even adults, why not, if they read the kind of literatures like the plays of Henri Njombo from Congo, Brazzaville, or Epe Inyang from Cameroon, or the novel of Nadia Origo. These are some of the works that I've used in that analysis. They will be able to be inspired to take more climate action. And of course, taken together, the texts themselves and also the analysis thereof help us to create more rooms for the inclusion of youth voices and other perspectives when we come to the tables of discussion or even policy making that will foster sustainability. And one other thing, or one other aspect of the transition to sustainability, or sustainability itself, that I think literature can be helpful in, is in terms of entanglement. Literature helps us, remind us of how entangled we are with the rest of the world. It reminds us that we are not out here and nature is there, but that we are part of nature. And so by reminding us this way, I think it helps us to be able to understand or to change our perspective and not look at the earth and not look at other elements and other beings that we share the earth with as being from a predatory perspective or an exploitative perspective or a hierarchical perspective where we place ourselves as humans up there and then other modern humans down there. But of course, we would rather look at ourselves as being immersed in our shared home, the earth. And of course, our literature also helps us therefore with agency and also with, for example, promoting the rights of nature. And this, of course, I understand the overlap here, because rights of nature also comes back to also even the entanglements I was talking about. But I'm saying that all, in a nutshell, this can help us therefore, for example, when we look at entanglement, when we are reminded of how we are part of the rest of nature, or of our kinship with other beings, with other animals, this can help us, for example, change our perspectives or become more positive towards, for example, biodiversity conservation. And then when it comes to, for example, and then literature can also help us, because one thing is that other literature, not only literature, but arts, and of course, literature and arts helps us in that it can permit some kind of agency of nature to be felt, because other disciplines have the tendency of treating, the earth as being just this inert materiality, but literature, of course, we know that humans try to do that, but we try as writers to allow nature to express itself, and not only itself, but as speaking, as allowing it to speak for itself, or to also express its being and not its inertness. I think at the same time, we also, art and literature gives room for nature, elements of nature and other beings that we share the earth with, to be able even to express their agency by, for example, striking back. For example, I use a play that I've analyzed known as Watana Life. Watana Life is in Pidgin English in Cameroon, and it means water is life. And then I've analyzed it together with Henri Njombo's play Le Mal de Terre, which is something like maybe the sickness of the earth. There's an approximate translation, and by the way, and I'm trying to argue for how these plays engage with freshwater pollution and disorderly urbanization in ways that shows us that, of course, and that is not too new for us anyway, that when we overstep boundaries, when we overstep planetary boundaries, when we overstep boundaries, that the earth can strike back. It can come, and that can be maybe in the form of waterborne diseases, maybe in the form of landslides and other activities. And I think this heightens awareness about what nature is, but what the rest of the earth is, and then our relationship to it. And of course, literature and arts, I think, can also help us to put together, not only because I think there is no transition if we don't also put human rights at the core. And then by putting human rights, we also put the rights of animals. And so by so doing, we can be able to tune down on our tendencies for exploitation, our tendencies for abuse, and also the increasing level at which sustainability is being anchored on capitalism and the commodification of nature. And literature and art, I think, can also help us, for example, in dealing with issues of climate justice and also humanizing the climate crisis. And here in terms of climate justice, but also including epistemic justice. And I think this also goes back to some of the discussion that we already had relating to Jorge's presentation. And that I think literature and art from an environmental humanities perspective can help us to address or to identify and also address different forms of injustice, such as climate, environmental, and epistemic injustice, especially those against local and indigenous people. And here I'm thinking, for example, that it can help us by giving us insights from local and indigenous people. But at the same time, I'm also thinking about even instances such as, for example, the forceful displacement of indigenous people in the Congo Basin when national parks are being erected. And also the epistemic erasure that goes with that in terms of the knowledge systems and other non-Western knowledge systems that exist in the Congo Basin or in the Amazon or elsewhere. And also, of course, I think that literature and art can help us in terms of the humanization of the crisis. And here I'm talking about the ability and the capacity for literature and art to be able to put a human face to the data and the statistics that we find in other disciplines, especially the pure sciences, because many people do not find it easy to relate with charts and graphs and stale data. But by, for example, giving a human face, putting human faces, albeit fictional, through this data, we can be able to arouse more empathy in people to understand the reality or to perceive and to connect with, to feel a more genuine connection with the seriousness of the climate crisis in terms of, for example, climate-induced disasters and displacement. So in this way, we can also be able to humanize even threatened species and also the earth. And in this way, we are creating, of course, empathy. And I'm thinking about, for example, climate refugees or climate-induced displacement, whether it is internal or transnational or even transcontinental. And for good examples that I have from Congo Basin literature would be, for example, movements of people in a play called Le Cri de la Forêt by Henri Njombo and José Kouagne. And so, which means that already, of course, and I also acknowledge that there is great work being done now by scholars in the environmental humanities, especially studying the nexus between climate, environment, and migration. And then finally, I think also that literature and arts can help us to tackle sustainability questions from looking at issues or highlighting and also questioning and challenging green imperialism, for example, and then helping us to imagine alternatives or alternative futures, including clean futures, but also not always good and positive futures. So the first thing I think literature can help us to, especially in places like the Congo Basin, to be able to identify what is or what are manifestations of green imperialism and capitalism, and also maybe pointing out loopholes and shortcomings in practices such as forest conservation, and then the risks and the inequalities that the commodification of nature and capitalism entail. And in this way, we'll be addressing, for example, SDG 10, reduce inequalities, and also, of course, the displacement of indigenous people in a novel like Les Marchands du Développement Durable by Situ Ndinga from Congo, Brazzaville. And I should note that Situ Ndinga is a biologist by training with a PhD in biology and has worked for many years with different conservation organizations in the Congo Basin and elsewhere in Africa. And he writes this beautiful novel in which you see the mismatch between sustainable development as planned from outside and then brought in and being imposed on people, including indigenous people, without any room for engaging with their own ideas, with their own plans, with their own vision of what sustainable development could be. And then also literature, especially petrofictions and art about petrofictions, especially when we talk about, for example, the Global South. And I'm thinking here not only about the Congo Basin, nearly all the countries in the Congo Basin are rich in oil, like Cameroon, like Gabon. But if we could even extend beyond the Congo Basin to next door Nigeria, where we know about the famous Niger Delta, not noted for its petrol, but also the atrocities of the petrol extraction. I think literature and art can help us in critiquing dirty energy, especially the energy humanities. And in this way, it also helps us to usher in alternative futures based on a transition to cleaner and sustainable energy sources. And this again is addressing specific SDGs. And finally, I think literature and the arts also have this ability to, to imagine both desirable and undesirable futures. The imaginative power of literature, whether it is climate fiction, whether it is even more literature that might seem to some people to be more didactic in nature, but I think one thing that is common for them is that it can help us to think beyond the present and then to imagine where we want to go, whether we want to go in for a disaster or want to go in for something better. For example, if literature is portraying dystopic worlds, I think some people will question that and say it has a weakness, but I think it can also mobilize people to work against not having that dystopic world come to reality. And of course, literature can also help us with some kinds of utopias that we might also consider as being the ideal and start working towards them because we think they are more sustainable. So and of course, to conclude, literature can also help us, and this goes back to one of the points that Jorge made, to challenge some of our metaphors, because he mentioned the point of interrogating even our vocabularies, because I think one of the things that many of us do agree on is that the climate crisis is as much as a technological and scientific problem as it is a cultural problem. And so we need a revision of mentalities to be able to sort out this problem. I think that literature can be quite good at tackling the mental aspect through engaging with metaphors and creating new narratives, or questioning our vocabularies and helping us to reinvent and come out with new ones. So I will end here for now. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Kenneth. Again, we have a few minutes for questions based on Kenneth's presentation. People are probably formulating questions as we speak. I'm going to start with, I guess, a bit of a naive question, but really, you described many ways in which literature, for example, can contribute to change towards sustainability. I'm thinking the number one challenge that I see with this is how to get people to read, how to get people to engage with that kind of literature. Yeah. Because I can see how it can open up a lot of new imaginaries, but maybe the first step can be also the hardest.
yeah, and that's a very relevant question. You might have called it naive or whatever you call it, but I think that's a very relevant question. Many people ask me when they listen to me make these kinds of claims. And this is also very relevant because, you know, I come from the Congo Basin, and a lot of my work is based on the Congo Basin. And of course, this is in Central Africa. And there is also the problem of readership might be global, but it also becomes acute in some parts of the African continent. And so I am well aware of this. And the answer I would give to you is that I think first, I am not talking only about literature. I'm talking about literature and art more generally. And this means that we can also, you know, and there is always this fertile, I don't know how to call it, but let's say there is this fertile reciprocal or mutual or symbiotic relationship between different forms of art, in the sense that we've seen time and again novels adapted into film, novels even adapted into plays, which means that, so this is one way of solving this problem. That some people might not want to read a book, but they might want to go to the cinema. They might want to watch Netflix, and that's where we can get them either through different forms of narratives, not only textual narratives, if we are maybe looking at the global north perspective, or certain parts of the global south. But then coming specifically to also to like the Congo Basin, where I know that sometimes one of the greatest problems is, I don't want to claim that people don't read. We have a number of people who read, but we also have a number of people who don't read for a number of reasons. Perhaps maybe because of their purchasing power, because they might not be able to buy the books. But another problem would be the difficulty of getting books by some of us. By the way, I'm a writer, I'm a poet too. Having books by some of us, or most of the books that I analyze in my thesis, for example, published by Western publishers in Western capitals, say Paris for Francophone Africa, or say London and the New York for Anglophone Africa. And for the most part, people are not, you know, like Amazon is not present on the continent, so buying a book on Amazon is a big deal. So these are some of the challenges, but I think that it's also like, when I talk about literature and arts, I'm talking about the more globally, more generally, and in this sense, therefore, other forms of literature can be more accessible to people. For example, poetry. We must not wait for people to come and buy a poetry collection on environmental and climate and sustainability issues. We can take it to them through poetry readings in their quarter, in their village, where they live. So I think that there are other ways to move around it, while also hoping that the analysis we make of this could also encourage other people to go looking for the original sources to read.
Thanks very much, Kenneth. Sylvia, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly about that, the last thing that Kenneth said, because I think the performing arts, visual arts, storytelling depends on the context. You have some places where people read a lot of people watch Netflix, but maybe in some other areas, you need to go in with active storytelling, which might be more aligned with the traditions of the place. And this is something that I'm trying to get into in Uruguay, because especially to work with younger children, it's extremely useful to perform and not to read or just show a video. It's an entirely different way of taking in the information. And by the way, if anyone knows where I can train in storytelling from the environmental point of view, please jot it down in the chat, because it's the line of work that I would like to get into now. Thank you.
Great. That's beautiful, and especially the point with children. Yeah.
Thank you, Sylvia. Lucy, you have a question, maybe, or a comment.
Yeah, well, it's a sort of comment follow-on thing. So thank you so much, Kenneth, for that really interesting talk. It chimes so well with a lot of my work, which looks at relationships with the environment from an anthropological perspective. But recently, what I really wanted to say now was recently I've come across a kind of genre in literature called cli-fi, which, climate fiction. And it's often really dystopic and depressing and looks into the future as a terrible, dreadful place, that as an inevitability, really. I was wondering what you thought about that kind of literature. And also I just wanted to add that there are now some young people who are writing positive cli-fi for the futures they want, almost like trying to draw it into being somehow by writing about it or thinking about it. There's a lovely website that I can put in the chat for people to see some of the stories that have recently won prizes. But Kenneth, what do you think about that kind of literature?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that for asking that question, Lucy. Yes, I agree with you that cli-fi is a very important and crucial genre in questions or in matters of sustainability and addressing the climate and ecological crisis. And of course, it has come also under criticism for because there is a school of thought that thinks that the doom, doomism, climate doomism, that is not helping a lot, especially up here in the global north, where a lot of people, especially young people, are now showing signs or symptoms of suffering from one form of climate anxiety or the other. So that has been criticized. But I think that for me, a good approach is just to keep the two going, to keep the two rolling. And because there are also people who are, for example, criticize the apocalyptic trope, because a lot of this that is anchored on the doomism, climate doomism, the end of the world, flooding, when the world ends in a flood, or when the world ends in another form, whether fire. I think yes, it does this. It creates fear in people. And people have also criticized, saying that they are apocalyptic. So by creating fear or by making some people not just like that genre, they might not just shut up the light. They might not open up to other possibilities of interacting with the text, and then perhaps maybe we assume and then translating that into some action or some transformation in either whether their consumption patterns or other things that they do that impact the world negatively. So, but I think that for me, the good approach would be to keep the ball rolling. I've read plays that are quite comic in dealing with the climate crisis, but there are also people who criticize such plays for trivializing a serious matter. So I think that for different audiences, we might be able to choose different modes. And of course, there is a lot of research now going on, especially in empirical ecocriticism, that also includes the affective dimension of climate arts and climate literature. And I think that there might just be different people that will react to different kinds of emotion. For some people, positive emotions will do, but for some people, negative emotions might still do. So that's my take for now, but let's see how it goes.
Thank you, Kenneth, and thank you, Lucy, for that question. Let's now move on to our last presentation for today from Nathalie. Nathalie, if you're ready, then you are free to go ahead whenever you want.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gilles, and thank you for the invitation, everyone. Let me be sure that you see. Yep. Yeah, I think that's good. So let me introduce my talk as by presenting myself. I am a geographer, a bizarre geographer, I would say, because I come from fine arts and I was in fine arts in the 80s. And so I decided at the time I was in fine arts in Paris, I decided that fine arts were not engaged enough with political perspectives. That's why I moved to geography. So I did the contrary somewhat. And doing fine arts, I was with Christian Boltanski, who is a very well-known visual artist, and working with words and with banners and putting words and collecting words in the streets in order to show off how the street was built up from conversation grabbed randomly through the day. So that was a practice, an artistic practice, which borrowed a lot to randomness, to the environmental issues, as I discover the following years. So getting into, so I went into the National Center for Scientific Research from this perspective, because I did my study on cockroaches in the city, because I worked on garbages, words which were picked up randomly and which could be thought like garbages or, you know, random words. And I decided in 2006 just to introduce in the environmental field in France the perspective of arts, which was not so much discussed at the time. So that's when in 2008 we had this first journal number, which was of Ecologie politique, which was called Literature Towards an Eco-Poetic, and which is still quoted as being pioneer in the field in France, because it is very new. It was very new. And at the same time, I decided to introduce the issue of environmental aesthetic in France. That was in 2006 at the Ministry of Agriculture. And so I invited artists to grade ice of the Antarctic as a concert, you know, and that was kind of a shock for my colleague of the Ministry of Agriculture, I guess. So I was always aware as a geographer and as an artist of the importance of feeling, imagination, narratives, and values, which are very much threading them. And nowadays, as the director of the Center of Politics, I am trying again and always to bring together arts and science. So I'm just going to show in the few minutes that I have how this discussion in between arts and geography have been leading me to different experiments and hybrid writing techniques in between academic and poetic. So let me show you very briefly a first experiment, and I'll go from this experiment and comment about it. In 2015, we did this show. You can see images of this show, which was called Soil Fiction. I was the coordinator of this show, and that was a show that involved like 15 artists and scientists for a year. And we were all in residencies near Paris at the Domaine de Chamarande. And we discussed collectively for this year how we could discuss artistically the soil issue. You know, we in the field of science, we have the soil issue was not very much discussed until recently. And we need soil being alive in order to be able to grow food, for example, or even for all kind of different reasons. And we decided that it could be a good idea to discuss in between the arts and science what could be the soil issue. You can see on the my left hand side on the herbarium, the small picture. So as a part of the exhibition, you can see in 10 herbariums, and there were examples of how the soil of the future could be seen. For example, the first 3 herbariums were soil of nowadays. For example, soil where you grow food, soil under the sea, soil under the city pavement. But also the last one were more dedicated to being exemplaries of what could be imaginary soils, like soil of Mars or soils of the future, a very degraded soil. So this kind of speculative exhibition where also we also try to tackle how to make people feel about this soil of the future. And the other part of the exhibition were created by binomials of one artist, one scientist trying to work together and showing out some part of what was an experimental art work. So I won't discuss very much about this one, and except to say that we worked very much with literature because this is mostly my trade. So, and we edited these small books, which was called Soil Farers, Solifères in French, and we discussed absurd beings in the soil, like the one you see on the left-hand side. It's a tardigrade. I don't even know the name in English. I'm sorry, but it's a very much a living being. And so we had this writing workshop with the public and tried to make them work from the scientific point of view. So we distributed small booklets of scientific text about this absurd being living in the soils, and try to make the people who participated to this workshop imagine what could be said about this absurd being drawing from the scientific text. So what do you see? I guess this is my translation, so it's not so good. I'm very sorry. That was written in French. So on the right part of the screen, you see a text from Darwin, which is drawn from his text about his scientific study about worms. Worms are very important beings for soil fiction and for soils as such. And on the left-hand side, you can see a text drawn from this text of Darwin, which is an imaginary text about the same worms that were described by Darwin. So that was a very important workshop we did. And I'm just going to say, and we have written in French extensively about what we think we learned from this experiment. We did several experiments. First of all, the worm, which is the hero of the narrative, is not the worms, the object of the experiment of Darwin. I mean, these worms speaks of himself as an I, as a person, as a subjectivity, even though some would contest that the worm can have subjectivity. At least it has agency, and even Darwin recognized this agency, and it gives a view of the soil from the inside. So the experiment is an experience of thought that leads the writer to explore the world seen from the point of view of these very slimy creatures. And so this is the publication we did afterwards. And there were worms, there were tardigrades, there were different, soil farers. And this is the public reading we did afterwards also with my colleague. Another experiment, which was quite different, is in the framework of research creation of a few experiments of research creation throughout Europe. It's called Table and Territory. Table and Territory is now finished since last year, and we're going from one project to the other. Now we're going to talk about transformative practices at the scale of European small farms, artistic farms. And this Table and Territory was a program of research creation in 5 places in Europe, in different places, very different. And I don't really have time to describe them. And we have a book which is going to be released right now in a few days, which is called Art Farming. And I can't even remember, it's at Rutgers, so it's in English, and we can talk about it. And this table in territory is now, this place you see on the picture is a place in Paris, which is an experimental place. It's a farm, artistic farm, who is run by an artist and a poet, Olivier Darny. He has created this artist, what he called the concrete honey, the honey built of the concrete of the city. So it's a very hard honey, but very good, with less pesticides than the honey you can find in the countryside. And while we were having this project, Table and Territory, we conducted different writing workshops, as you can see on this slide. Some of them were with kids, but some others were with adults and different persons. We adopted the same creative methodology, distributing different texts, scientific texts about food issues, and try to make people think about what this text had to say about these food issues and how people could relate, poetically speaking, to what was discussed in the scientific text. For example, in these two examples, you find the black hand side is the scientific text. So it's talking about food miles. How many miles are being run by different food food products. And so one of the participants thought about the rhythm of the cucumber and tried to explore what it meant to have this cucumber facing you during a market, and how many miles did it also had to travel before having to face this person. So you see what kind of different ways of seeing all pieces of the environment it brings. Talking with an eye, the subjective focal, allows the expression of moral dilemmas. I mean, this is a very important issue for environmental humanities, the moral dilemmas. Showing also that any component of the natural world can be engaged on a sensitive level, and not only some elected species. I guess we can talk of anything in a poetic manner. And also embodying the way every element of the environment is breathing in our world. I mean, it's not just us, and I think it is very important. So, and one part of this experiment was done collecting stories, recipes, because I decided that stories were not only academic stories or writer stories, but also stories we tell with food, cooking recipes, for example, you know, what I call the way people, subaltern people do talk, even though they don't use words, but they use flavors, they use colors, they use all kind of ways of making symbolic meaning. And that's, I think, part of what we have to discuss in the framework of environmental humanities. So I did collect stories about recipes. It was a great part of them was collected with migrants from a different generation of migration, but especially women, I would say. They are the one who talk the more ordinarily of recipes and food issues like that. And so we did this book and invited the women afterwards on the farm, this artistic farm, and they had to cook one of their recipe of the book And that book was kind of a good success because it decided other collectivities of the neighborhood to do the same work. And I decided not to engage anymore because they wanted me to do more and repeat the experiment. But as much as I like to engage with research creation projects, I am not the one who is able to repeat them. It's more the fun of that. So I don't think, I don't know how much time I have, Gilles, but perhaps I should stop there, tell me, because I always say that I have nothing to say, then I end up being much too long.
Typical of researchers. But yeah, if you can conclude in a minute or two, that would be great. So we
okay. So one last experiment, I did a lot of them. So it's just to show some of them which are relevant for our discussion. And one of them was with not only blind people, but all kinds of people, but we also worked with blind people and trying to collect stories with text messages, you know, using devices like portable phones, mobiles, and wandering through streets and places and just trying to make them engage collectively in online making of a story about the place, meaning that they didn't have to recollect afterwards what they thought of the place, but they could engage proactively with the place while they were walking the streets or the path of different places. And so from these fragments of stories, we built up a bigger story, which was discussed in many places. We did that in different cities in Europe. And that was more or less of a success. And we can discuss that, why that I didn't think that was perhaps the better way to engage with this issue. But the interesting way in this way of collecting stories is to deal with fragments. And this is a literary form which hasn't been discussed a lot in the context of the Anthropocene, but which I think very relevant to give back of our to relate to our encounters with the environment with this very degraded environment of nowadays. We don't have full stories, we have fragments of stories which relate to our feelings, emotions of all kinds. And so we have to think of what narrative forms are important nowadays, what kind of art should we talk about, because we're not able to tell much of the future. So I'll stop there and say that a lot of that has been published, a bit in French, a lot in French and some in English, so I can engage with that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. And right away, in fact, there is a question for you in the chat from Gary. I don't know, Gary, if you would be able to ask that question directly to Nathalie, if you're able to use your mic.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Gilles. Really fascinating conversation, and I'm really getting more and more interested in and trying to apply arts and humanities kind of approaches in the work I do. So I'm the Principal Specialist for Strategic Science in Natural England, which is the government's advisor on the natural environment in England. And I keep coming across this kind of other than human perspective, and I struggle. And maybe it's because I was trained as a natural scientist, I don't know. Maybe you can assure me. So the question that I put in there was a question about the validity of other than human perspectives. And I can kind of understand them as metaphor, and I can understand them as kind of storytelling devices. But beyond that, do they have validity? And really kind of getting the sense of, can we really ever know what a worm's perspective is, or a cucumber's perspective is, or an orangutan's perspective is, because we don't understand our own human perception, let alone any other perception of other species. So when we're talking or speaking or acting as them, what are we really doing? And I wondered if you could advise on that.
Well, I think we're trying to empathize. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. Can you hear me? Yeah. I think I am trying to empathize with other forms of beings. For example, I'm going to give you an example. I've been working with scientists on cockroaches since many years. I mean, and so there are other forms of beings, and I have been working on the dynamic of population of cockroaches and trying to engage in between representation of practices of population and the genetic dynamic of this population of cockroaches. And I've done that many years until one day a dancer told me, "Can you dance like a cockroach?" And so I thought about it. That was a strange experiment, even for me. I mean, I'm very open to all strange experiments, but that one. And suddenly I tried, because you have to engage. And then I realized that there were aspects of the cockroach I knew about that I never thought before engaging into this dance. Like how they moved, it's not wings, but I don't know the term in English, whatever they have and make them more or less fly. So I think what we try to do when we do that is try to put yourself in, displace the way you're thinking about the environment. Change your perspective, meaning empathize with the environment. And see, if you try yourself to do it, you'll see how much it changes. That's very strange. That's an experiment of thought. And that has been done by many writers, in fact, especially strangely in the Russian literature. There is a strong literature where you take the point of view of an animal in order to know your world around. So I think we have to think on what it brings in this way.
But it's only really ever a human projection of that animal's perspective.
Well, I guess it's the same that not knowing about what you think. I mean, I don't think I know better what you think than I know better what the worm thinks. I mean, it's a bit provocative as a thought, but if you put Wittgenstein, for example, I mean, we have all a very private life, even for ourselves. I don't know. I mean, it's something I'm. But I see
wonderful discussion for a Friday afternoon, isn't it? Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathalie, and thanks, Gary. Jorge.
Even at the risk of going further into that ontological discussion, I will step for a moment away from the more deeper philosophical implications about it. But one thing that the stories of the work that Nathalie has been telling us is that they do have an impact in changing behavior. The opportunity, the possibility that experiment of thought, which is also a performative experiment, because they have to do something, apparently have a significant better possibility of changing behavior. And so I just wanted to bring that up, that this is not only a discussion about the ontology of the animal. We can follow that path as well, but one of the other benefits is that there may be a change of behavior here in the near horizon that can be very significant and very relevant for people taking care or supporting environmental initiatives, sustainable initiatives, regardless as to the outcome, final outcome about the conversation. And the other point is that when you're dealing with people outside the modern world, there is a I would rather say that probably more people in the world, more people in this planet live under the assumption that the animal has properties that we associate only with human beings, or that even plants have properties that we only associate with human beings. So that's a fact that everything we do have to deal with. And the great thing about doing insight projects, problem solving projects, is that it helps to set an agenda as to how far we're going to go into certain conversations that will create more difference, as opposed to where can we find common ground in order to deal with a specific problem. But we have to deal with the fact that the majority of the people in the planet right now do have that perception of the non-human world as animated. So we have to negotiate with that, and the on-site work helps how to prioritize, how to negotiate those kind of things.
Thanks for adding to that. Lucy and I see Kenneth also, you have your hand raised. I don't know if it's to try maybe doing a cockroach dance, or perhaps you want to keep going down that path on more than human perspectives. In any case, go ahead, Lucy.
Thank you. I'm not going to do a dance at all. You can all relax. But I do want to say, Natalie, I really loved your presentation. Thank you so much. I really would love to be able to read something about your soils fiction. So if you've got a link or something, would you mind putting in the chat? Or it would be, or perhaps I can just find it. Just give me an indication of where that writing is. I'll seek it out. But I also do think that Gary's question is illustrative of part of the problem with transdisciplinary work. And that's really what this whole thing is about, you know, what we're supposed to be talking about here, because, you know, there are knowledge cultures. And Gary, sorry to use you here, but you illustrated how held you are within the knowledge culture that you've been trained to think through and think about the world with. So I'm agreeing with what Jorge was saying about ontologies, but I'm changing it now to knowledge cultures. This is exactly the kind of issue that we need to really interrogate very, you know, sort of assertively, robustly, to not just say, okay, look, everybody sees things differently, but how can those seeing things differently work together? And so then, you know, what Natalie is doing is getting us all to think about that by using something as a tardigrade or a worm's perspective. It's, you know, that's the challenge. How can we find ways to blend our perspectives or find synergies between our perspectives, because they're all happening at the same time concurrently? This world is shaped by all of those perspectives. So you know, that's the work to be done. No, sorry, I talked a lot, forgive me. Natalie, please come back to me. Oh, Natalie, you're being brilliant in the chat, thank you so much.
Thanks, Lucy. Kenneth, did you want to add?
Yeah, just a quick, two quick remarks I wanted to make. To say, yeah, talking about the modern human perspective, I have even, for example, written a poem from the perspective of a stone. And of course, I acknowledge that that is me writing from the I call it stone language, or what stones call it, because I might call it the language of stones, but I also just right from my title, I make it clear that it might still be that stones call it a different thing. And what I think writers and artists try to do when they are capturing this, or it's not about, we cannot exactly speak from the perspective of something else, but I think it is pointing us, opening up possibilities, and the possibilities that exist, and so making us understand, especially that things are not always the way we think. Even if we don't know what the other thinks, we must acknowledge at least something that they think, that they think differently. And then these possibilities also now open up us to, for example, I think new cultures and new ways of life that are centered around caring and respect for the other, or for the modern human. And then the last quick remark I wanted to make was also about the ontological debate, and also like, I think once we start going that way to also start going into the epistemological debate, and we might start asking questions like ontologically from a Western perspective, from a non-Western perspective, or epistemologically, because of course we are very much aware of many non-Western traditions, many non-Western cultures and ways of life in which everything is believed to have a soul. Everything is believed to be living, and of course, even if you take like even the spirituality of where I come from, they are people capable of bringing messages from the river, bringing messages, interpreting or hearing the message given by the sacred river or the sacred tree or the sacred rock, and so on and so forth. So I think, and when we start doing this, I think it's also just about provocation, but also calls for agreeing at least that there is no one way of knowing, and so we open up to other forms of knowledge, other forms of relations with the earth.
Great. Well, it really looks like we have gradually moved into a more general discussion. I just want to give Nathalie an opportunity to maybe get back to this discussion, if you had anything to add, or whether we should open it up to any questions essentially that people may have at this stage.
No, I'm just thinking about the embeddedness of art nowadays. I mean, that's something that I am really working upon. Because art has been more and more on market, and while a lot of these practices of arts and ecology are just trying to transform places and ways of seeing these places, so very embedded. And so I think, I mean, it goes back to what the famous economist said, Carl Pogliani in 52, that we have to reverse, I mean, go back and re-embed a lot of our relationship to a lot of things, and not go through markets to do that. So that's just something, one of the consequences, I guess.
Thank you, Nathalie. I see in the chat that Hester has a provocative question, and we do like provocative questions here. I don't know if Hester, you'd be able to ask that question again, using your mic, just for the purpose of making it, maybe expanding on it.
What I'm trying to ask here is that, you know, we often work in different worlds, and while we are trying to break these barriers down between the species, at the same time, we still have hovering over everything, this religious attitude of mankind being in charge of everything and having control about issues on Earth. And I really think we should start to talk more philosophically about how are we going to address this notion of us being the superior species on Earth. It does impede in a lot of our attitudes. It also impedes in the production of knowledge, you know, to start to produce things on an equal footing, rather than looking at each other on a you know, superior point of view. I talk about this because it's something that's very prevalent in Africa still, that, you know, we have these different worlds and the worlds don't speak to each other, and they impose in our world views. It also speaks to sustainability, and that's my last point, because we still have the notion that we can actually stop climate change, we can control the Earth's cycles, etc. Maybe we should start to face realities and say we are not in charge.
Are there any reactions or any follow-up comments on what Hester just talked about? Perhaps that will come later. I just want to jump to another comment that Kenneth just put in the chat about the relevance of the question of the relative invisibility of the environmental humanities in sustainability science. And maybe Kenneth, you want to address this more particularly, or perhaps you want to open it up to see what people think about this. Yeah, I'll leave it up to you, Kenneth, maybe to.
Yeah, I thought it would be a good idea to open it up and hear what other people think about it, and also particularly about ways of bridging that, or ways of reducing or making it more visible.
Topic. Any takers? Yes, Jorge.
I couldn't help but support Hester's comment on which is here, the evangelical stance, and I think it could be used as an example, Gilles, as to in what way counting with humanists in your team can be helpful. There is, so to put it closer to the geography I'm more familiar with, there is no way we can address environmental problems in Latin America without considering the imploding of the Catholic Church in the region, that on the one hand is part of this process of the rise of evangelical church, which are so dominant in politics in general in South America, and the indifference of the Catholic Church members to the message coming from the Pope. So we have to start that other chain that starts linking the things in order to address this kind of. So I thought that would be an example as to Hester was greatly putting an example of the kind of things that can be addressed. I also want to make the case that hopefully what we are proving today with the conversation is not only that art and literature is necessary, but the people that talk about art and literature are necessary. And you were making a comment about a question about the readership before. Literature has been, first of all, there are more people in the world that are literate now than in the past, and literature was very impactful when people were reading less. And so there is a power not only in the arts, but there is a power on the discourses that talk about the arts and the literature to have an impact on policy. And to a great extent, at least in the geographies I'm more familiar with, the job of the people that talk about art and literature has been related to helping in the process of nation building, or helping in the process of criticizing that project of nation building, because everything that has been left. That is something that can be brought to the conversation, but also is the opportunity for the humanities to engage with other issues. Right? For the issue that just Hester brought up is usually, in general, issues of religion are left out. So there is a gain also for the discipline of humanities as the study of art and literature to engage further with other sciences and other disciplines for renewing their own agenda.
Thank you, Jorge. I'm going to give the next question to Raki, because she hasn't had a chance to talk so far. Go ahead, Raki.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I just like to make comments rather than a question. It's so my mind is stuck on IPCC reports and the scientific evidence that is available out there that has attributed the climate crisis to greenhouse gas emissions caused by humans. And having said that, I think that we as human beings have the power or the opportunities to remedy the wrongs that we have done to the planet. But having said that, and knowing that the scientific evidence out there points to everything that we have done to the planet, I hope that there is a God out there that will help us in this climate crisis. So it's basically responding to Hester's comment and hoping that this community where we talk about transdisciplinary research and transdisciplinary science, we can bring all these disciplines together to ensure that we find the solutions in as human beings, because we brought this this crisis to this planet, and find the solutions together with humanities and the arts and science to basically involve all the different actors that are available, are at our disposal to bring about the solutions that we need. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raki. And before we wrap up, I'm going to give the floor to Lucy for one last comment or question. I'm not sure.
Thank you. It's a comment. So I don't think that Hester was referring to religion. She was talking, I think she was talking about human exceptionalism as a stance that we've all been, as academics and so on, we've all been trained to think in terms of the human and from a human perspective, and in that have elevated the human to be the thing that has made the problem that can then solve the problem. And that's the evangelical stance I think Hester was referring to. And I think if we cycle back to the beginning of this session here, there was mention of binary thinking and the binary of nature and culture. And in some ways, that's very much at root. And it links then to Kenneth's presentation, which was about almost trying to blur those boundaries that of the binary between nature and culture, the links of the human, the body, the flesh of an individual to the very soil that we grow from, that we're rooted into, that we rely on, the air that we breathe, that very essential connection to the world, and a non-binary thinking that doesn't put the human at the top, but rather embeds us deeper into the soil, like Ingold's dwelling that suggests we're wading through the world as the world, with the world being as much as the earthworm or any other entity is being. That's a perspective. It's not about religion or even the soul, but rather the real materiality of being part of this planet together and blending our thinking with the way it behaves in all of its different ways, rather than thinking we're separate and looking at the world. Take the world away, we're not here, we've gone too. So we are the world. And Hester has said in the chat that I got that right, so tick to me. Excellent. Phew, well done. Thank you.
Excellent, and thanks to you, Lucy. Yeah, it's unfortunately already time for us to wrap up. 2 hours is always too short when we are in such excellent company and talking about such fascinating topics. But this has been a very insightful discussion to follow. So thank you to all of you. Special thanks to our speakers today, Jorge Marcone, Kenneth Nsah, and Nathalie Blanc, and of course to Stephen Hartman and Lucy athalie from Bridges, who have been with us and who have made this webinar possible today. It was the first time that environmental humanities were the topic of a Pathways Forum, but something tells me that it won't be the last. And with this, I'm going to conclude today's session by thanking everyone once again, and hope to see many of you at another Pathways Forum or in a different context. It has been a pleasure. And until we meet again, take care.